Greetings everyone, Caboose30 here, coming to you not live but somehow not dead, with the next video in my BattleTech In-Depth series, Energy Weapons. Such weapons have been around for over 1,000 years, but only really started to become practical in the mid to late 21st century. They don't require ammo, have few moving parts, and are smaller and lighter than many other weapon types. Clans use them, house armies, Solaris gladiators, even the somewhat less technologically advantaged periphery nations use them. Today I'll be diving into what an energy weapon is, the history and capabilities of them, pros and cons, as well as how to best utilize them. Firstly, for the context of this video, let me briefly go over what an energy weapon is. Yes, some of you are rolling your eyes out there, but the more physics-minded among you will be nodding in agreement. Every weapon needs energy to fire. Modern mech and tank weapons need it in the form of electrons, but even handheld ballistic weapons need kinetic energy to actuate the trigger and engage the firing pin. In simple scope, an energy weapon takes electrons and converts them to high-energy photons or ions. On the surface, it doesn't sound so scary. I mean, we've seen laser pointers at staff meetings, or someone's homemade Tesla coil, Mark's generator, or even some atmospheric energy harvesters. Fun fact, if you take your average laser pointer and feed it through some precisely calibrated lenses at some kind of target, you can burn a hole through it. Everyone knows Tesla coils are dangerous if the proper safety precautions aren't taken, but what you don't know is that's basically a hobbyist PPC. Let me explain. First off, lasers. Laser itself is an acronym that means light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. Lasers use a system of reflectors, crystals, and a small vacuum chamber to produce coherent light. That is to say, it's all the same wavelength and emitted in a way that the waves don't interfere with one another, adding greatly to the distance it can cover while minimizing the attenuating effect of the atmosphere. In even more basic terms, it's the difference between a flashlight or a baseball traveling through fog. The flashlight scatters quickly and its energy gets dissipated quicker if the fog is dense. Meanwhile, the baseball has much more energy concentrated into a smaller cross-section, and it's all going exactly the same direction. The fog slows it down slightly more than regular air does, but the ball effectively pushes it out of the way. Now, a PPC is a whole different animal. A PPC, or particle projection cannon, is an extremely high-energy coil discharging into an open area and using a system of magnetic field generators to shape the discharge into a stream and/or projectile, as well as aim it. This gives it an electrical discharge as well as a kinetic impact, as high-density and high-energy particles are impacting a target at obscenely high speeds. The energy and thermal transfer soften armor. The kinetic impact blasts it away. With that covered, let's dive a little deeper in to see where these came from, what they can do, and what their best use case is. Just a side note about naval weapons. Naval lasers are so powerful they generate recoil. Think about that for a minute, and think about what that means to the scale of combat we've gotten used to. As a result, I'll be skipping naval weapons entirely, other than yes, they exist, and yes, they are enormous. Alright, so here we go. The very first laser came about in the mid-20th century on Terra. Or rather, that's when the first one was constructed. In reality, they had been theorized for decades before that, but it wasn't until smaller and more efficient semiconductors, light emitters, and control circuitry came about that they were actually able to be constructed. This laser couldn't do much more than put a small red dot on a wall, measuring in milliwatts at best. 50 to 60 years later, technology had come forward leaps and bounds, and so too did the laser. Handheld versions could do some actual damage and were used in many applications. We had them for signaling devices that were visible when regular lights were not. The medical field was using them for high-precision work. Industries had laser cutters and cleaners, and the military had weaponized lasers that could destroy enemy patrol boats or shoot down incoming missiles. See, besides higher output power, one of the things that was missing was the ability to focus megawatts of power onto a smaller area. Thus, as computing power caught up with our needs, someone invented and built a focusing array to go with the laser. The beam was generated, and as it was emitted, it passed through one stationary and one adjustable lens. The computer would get a reading on the target using yet another laser for range finding, then it would adjust the second lens to focus the beam down to the smallest point possible. A laser from this time period had somewhat of a long beam duration, so the computer constantly moved the lens to keep everything focused until the beam was shut off. Then the entire weapon was allowed to cool before firing again. As warfighting technology continued to advance, battlefield lasers diverged into two basic groups. There were ones that would fire for a split second and dump massive amounts of energy downrange, and ones that had a longer beam duration, requiring the person firing it to keep it trained on the target until it finished discharging. These haven't really been given terms, so I'm going to do this right now. low intensity discharge, and high intensity discharge. LID has the longer beam duration, making it difficult to concentrate damage in one area, but overall easier to score a hit on a moving target. HID makes the pinpoint hit simpler to get, but has a longer recycle time. There were also 3 main classes until you got into warship scale weapons: small, medium, and large. Not inventive, but also not easy to confuse. In reality, both discharge types averaged the same energy output over the entire discharge-recharge time. It all boils down to the preference of the pilot and/or designer of the vehicle they get mounted on. Fixed emplacements cope better with LID lasers, while mobile weapons platforms do better with HID types. As time wore on, LED lasers were left by the wayside in favor of that instant fire-and-forget style. Also, as time went on, notable shortcomings in lasers compared to other weapons were brought up at the design tables again and again. Low damage output compared to ballistic weapons, shorter range compared to missile and artillery weapons, and their smaller size made them relatively more fragile. Well, 2 of those problems were solved with both pulse and extended range models respectively. Pulse lasers do what they say on the tin. Rather than just pumping out more energy overall, they concentrate it into nanosecond-long pulses. This has multiple effects, including increasing damage output while minimizing recharge time at the expense of higher heat and somewhat shorter range. They're also more accurate than standard models, making the trade-offs more than worth it to many pilots, especially ones faced with fast-moving targets on a regular basis. The damage and accuracy increases are less obvious than most people think. The short-duration pulses give time for vaporized armor to dissipate out of the way before the next pulse hits. Also, the integral targeting system is able to keep the beam trained on the same area to increase the localized damage done, even at extreme ranges. Now for the range problem, that was resolved simply by throwing more power into the beam and adding some more precise focusing lenses. The capacitors, barrel, and emitters are all beefed up versions of the standard lasers. This allows for dumping nearly 60% more energy into it at every shot for a 30 to 50% range increase with a similar heat increase. Having a large laser that could precisely hit an enemy at a kilometer but requiring no ammunition was also deemed worth the trade-off. PPCs went through a similar evolution. It is my opinion that the standard inner sphere PPC is the best weapon per tonnage and cost than nearly any other. Reliable, long range, high damage, and ammo independent, what's not to like? Well, for starters, it has a hard time getting the shot to be completely stable under 90 meters. Oftentimes at that range, the particle beam isn't fully coherent and it can be scattered easier, making it difficult to land a hit due to the naturally unpredictable nature of what essentially is man-made lightning when close to a grounding source, i.e. the mech that fired it. Now, this can be overcome by doing something that will void your warranty, like disabling your field inhibitors. This allows the shot to become coherent much closer to the barrel of the weapon. So close, in fact, it may become cohesive in the barrel, destroying the weapon with the full energy of the shot while it's still inside the mech. This is such a massive breach in weapon safety that sensors of a nearby pilot can detect it before the shot is even fired, alerting your enemy to the fact that you're either desperate or fucking stupid. The other issue was similar to that of lasers. Yes, a PPC could reach out over half a kilometer and do some substantial damage, but once you pass that 500 to 600 meter mark, it would start bleeding off energy into the atmosphere rapidly. To combat this, pun intended, they also got an ER model like the lasers. This didn't increase the damage output, but due to superior components used as well as new targeting and tracking hardware, the PPC had its effective range increased reliably by 50%, eliminated the 90 meter problem, with the trade-off of its heat output going up by roughly the same margin. Again, no ammo and enough damage to strip a location of armor in 1 to 2 hits made the trade-off worth it to many pilots. Touching briefly on the clan equivalents, they completely ditched standard lasers and only have ER or pulse models available. All their laser weapons outstrip IS models in terms of damage and range. Their pulse lasers have better range than inner sphere standard lasers at nearly double the damage, and their ER models increase the damage by 50% to go with the 50% range increase. The ER large is also a ton lighter than the inner sphere large or ER large model. Their ER PPC also added a 50% damage increase to go with the heat and range increase, making it nearly equal to an AC-20 in terms of damage output, but at a kilometer range. Now, when the clans invaded, most of the inner sphere laser technology was blasted into oblivion. Go figure when you start listing engineering, design, and learning institutions as strategic targets, as well as the people that come out of them, after the span of a few short years pass, if you want to innovate, you're going to have a bad fucking time. Through sheer coincidence, the Grey Death Legion managed to uncover a complete and intact Starlink memory core on the planet Helm and made as many copies as they could. As Grayson Carlisle prepared to sacrifice his entire unit just to allow 2 dropships to blast off with as many copies as they could stuff in their pockets, some rare good guys in Comstar figured out what was going on and helped them. This allowed prototyping to be ongoing by the time the clan started to wreck shit, leading to a faster turnaround of advanced, compared to what they were using, weapons of just 2 years. This didn't quite level the playing field, and that was what the Inner Sphere forces sorely needed. While the clans liked to generalize and design a single weapon that could fit multiple scenarios, the IS realized that they were really shitty at that, and their strength lay in specialized mech designs. So, some genius decided, why not do that with mechs and weapons? PPCs got this treatment first, with light, heavy, and snub-nose variants. Personally, the heavy PPC is my favorite. But the snub-nose fits the Inner Sphere way of thinking the best. Get up in someone's face and blast it. Since the major downfall of the PPC was the field inhibitors in the barrel, some redneck genius decided, hey, if those are such a problem, why even have them? In fact, why not just get rid of the entire goddamn barrel? Can't melt it down if it's not there. So you have a gun that's got the same characteristics of the original, albeit with shorter range and a more pronounced damage drop-off at longer ranges. But you can literally stick that in the face of another mech and fire it with 0 ill effects. And since it dropped the barrel altogether, it's also 1 ton lighter, making it easier to mount on smaller and faster mechs that can take advantage of the up-close damage potential. Light and heavy models had their own take on it. They halved the PPC or beefed it up by about 50% respectively. The light PPC is the light mech pilot's dream come true. Same range, half the damage and half the heat of the standard PPC, but also at 40% of the weight. While it has the same damage output of a medium laser, which frankly isn't that impressive, what is impressive is it can do it at up to around 750 meters compared to the medium laser's 400 meters on a good day. Thus, you have the light PPC sniper. Heavy PPCs took this in the complete opposite direction. Instead of 7 tons, it weighs 10. Able to vaporize just shy of a ton of armor every hit, this leveled the playing field against clans, PPCs in every way except one: range. Try as hard as they could, Inner Sphere engineers just couldn't bridge the range gap. So, someone thought, fuck it, if we can't make it hit further, we'll make this bastard hit harder. Enter the PPC capacitor. Exactly like it sounds, it's a 1-ton capacitor bank that you literally strap in line to your PPC's power feeds. It extends the beam output by a scant second, barely noticeable to our own perception, but that adds a fixed damage and heat increase to every PPC you bolt onto an IS mech equal to a single light PPC shot. This is my favorite design. Take a heavy PPC, strap on the capacitor, and you have what's effectively an AC-20's worth of damage in every shot, all the way up to about 750 meters of range, ammo free. Now there's a risk that comes with this, and some of you probably already thought about it already. If you're adding the power output of a light PPC to something that's already funneling gigajoules of energy, what happens when something goes wrong? If anyone has ever seen what happens when you plug the barrel of a shotgun, you'll be able to visualize this clearly. The energy discharge sometimes can't vacate the barrel fast enough. The field inhibitors will engage before the blast has passed them, effectively plugging the barrel via electromagnetic means and, well, no more barrel. Well, what about the snub-nose, I hear you ask? It doesn't have a barrel. Well, yes, that's true. However, the root issue is the same. You're dumping more power into something that's already running at 100%. This is a gamble with every shot, regardless of use case or weapon pairing. Just like you wouldn't want to shoot shotgun shells out of a pistol unless you have no other option, the same is true with the PPC capacitor. That's why it has to be manually charged and discharged. The PPC can function without it, but it's there in case the pilot needs that little extra damage edge and they're up against a wall. Now admittedly, Inner Sphere techs got a lot less creative with lasers. Very early on there was the binary laser cannon, which was basically 2 large lasers duct taped together. This gave you the heat output of 2, but the damage potential of 1.5, and doubled the tonnage as well. Never really got further than that, and almost nobody used them. X-pulse lasers were longer range pulse lasers, but had heat output too high to really be useful except in rare circumstances. There were re-engineered lasers that tried to combine ER and pulse models with the benefits of neither and the drawbacks of both. Though what they did achieve on accident was a weapon that could penetrate laser reflective armor. Niche use, but noteworthy. The bomb blast laser was a regular laser with a lot of capacitors, which you had to manually charge and discharge. The benefit was you could exceed a large laser's damage by an additional 50%. Downside was literally everything else. Range, heat, slow firing time. About the only people that still use it are Solaris Arena fighters, and that's just because the glowing barrel from leaky power feeds looks cool. Chemical lasers, which were basically dusting off centuries-old tech, standard laser with its own power supply. Nothing to write home about, but useful for low-tech worlds. Chemical lasers basically had a chemical battery with them that allowed them to fire. It was actually kind of a brilliant idea because it would meter out how much each shot consumed from the chemical battery, and that gave you a functional ammo count. The downside, of course, was hauling around, big pools of noxious and corrosive chemicals in whatever needed to fire the laser, which, thankfully, we were smart enough not to... Son of a bitch. Just once, just one time, I want to get through a video without screaming, explosions, or some mix of the two.
So, Caboose, sir, I've got some good news and some bad news.
You never call me sir unless something happened. Is somebody on fire again?
Oh, not yet. I guess that's another piece of good news then.
Is everybody alive out there? Okay, nobody's dead. What's the bad news?
Well, you know the chemical laser that we were fitting onto the APC?
If by we mean you, then yes.
Well, I kinda spilled the chemicals in the bay. That was the screaming.
That's full of chlorine, fluorine, and hydrogen peroxide. Why haven't you evacuated yet?
But that's the good news. It was Capellan manufacture. It's got about as much chlorine and fluorine as pool water. We're all good. Well, except for another piece of bad news, I guess. We don't actually have fuel for our chemical laser.
Well, I guess I can live with that.
Oh, I've got another piece of good news. If you'll just sign off here, we're already fully stocked for our zero-gravity pool.
Just get back to work and clean up the mess. So, where was I? Right, chemical lasers. The only real additional laser innovation that came about was the variable speed pulse laser. This doubled the weight of a standard pulse laser, which was already double the weight of a standard laser. But what it did do was bump up the range until it was equal to a standard laser by optimizing the pulses fired depending on the range of the target. This leads to above the normal damage done at close range and makes it even easier to hit the target at the cost of damage and accuracy fall off at long range. The clan's only real laser innovation in response to this was the heavy laser. Same tonnage and range as Ionosphere standard lasers, these were made by engineers fed steroids and cocaine. Firstly, each laser is enormous, twice or more of the size of their Ionosphere counterparts. The range decrease over what they were accustomed to made these a hard sell already. When clan leadership saw how straight up huge they were, lots of clanners started to turn away from the demo. But then the test laser opened fired. A single heavy large laser, while 120% the heat output, exceeded the damage of your typical clan PPC at 2 tons less weight. With the numbers rolling in, suddenly all the attention was on the technicians and engineers. Pilots wanted the chance to use the weight savings for armor, maybe extra heat sinks, ammo. It allowed amazing flexibility in future designs without sacrificing firepower. For slower mechs, it finally gave them an effective light mech deterrent that was close range and lightweight. For fast movers, well, we've all seen that unwary assault get its ass blasted off by a speedy light. What most of us haven't seen is the light mech do it from the front instead. The other downside of the heavy laser was that due to the sheer amount of power dumped into them, they borderline fried your sensors at every shot. That's part of why they were so huge. They needed that just for electromagnetic and thermal insulation. So the clan made the improved model that eliminated this shortcoming. Instead, your capacitors might explode in a similar manner to a Gauss rifle if it takes a direct hit. The clans also developed micro ER and pulse modules, but they're extremely restrictive because of their low range. They're mainly used on protomechs, and that's another video entirely. So now you have the ability to dump megajoules of energy downrange. What next? Which lasers are better or worse? Which mech should you mount them on? Well, I asked a regular expert, Bacon, to give me his take on each model as I go through them. Now, we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I respect the man's opinion as I typically play more of a fire support role. We're just going to go over the common battlefield weapons here. There's not much point in dreaming up a scenario in which the bomb blast laser is actually fucking useful. Side note, in Meat Space, Bacon is actually deployed right now, so extra thanks for him taking the time to write all this, and please take a moment to wish him well in the comments. Small laser, because infantry cleanup with machine guns are too humane and flamers are too much fun. Range issues aside, they're a very good choice for light mechs and mechs needing to squeeze in some extra firepower. Medium laser, the workhorse of the inner sphere. These bad boys are everywhere and for good reason. The most bang for your buck, period. Sometimes KISS is all you need. Large laser. While not immaculate like the medium laser, weighing more and running notably hotter, you do get more punch and range. Great in some scenarios, overkill in others. Micro ER laser. These things are a pitiful sidearm at best and really only see use for mechs that are incredibly pressed for room or as an afterthought. ER small. Some like their pea shooters to fire a little further. I prefer not to bring one. Having said that, adding a little range to an otherwise ancillary weapon is a wise choice if you have the cooling and cash for it. ER medium. For some extra heat, you get some extra range. Plain and simple trade-off that I find a bargain. ER large. Great if costly long-range weapons, many will argue for the PPC despite its minimum range. I argue that those who aren't armed for brawls do not walk away from brawls. PPCs. They're good at mid-range and pack a decent punch, but the heat is going to be an issue for some pilots. Also, they're surprisingly small compared to many other weapons of similar damage capability, thus one can pack a surprising amount of firepower in a small area for the price of piloting a sauna on legs. Oh, and anything that fucks over a squirrely stealth bitch is a plus. Your mech techs hate these things. ER PPC. I like these on paper but not in practice. I'd stay away from the inner sphere models, but the clan version is a real treat at long range if you've got the cooling for it. Heavy PPCs. These monsters are a testament to the Combine's ability to trade sensible social planning for weapons engineering. It's a PPC but bigger and meaner. If you got the room and sinks, then rock it. Light PPCs. Never bring a light PPC when you can bring an ER medium. While some of your Bushido types may enjoy the extra range, I like being able to keep the fun going when I have close encounters of the unexpected kind. Snub-nose PPC. My personal favorite PPC, these are nasty little things and great in a brawl, but are PPCs in name only. They're the black sheep of the PPC family. Small pulse. I almost feel bad when I see these things used on infantry. Those that aren't getting an impromptu epilepsy diagnosis will look like spent birthday candles. Medium. Great for those run-and-gun types, and not bad for those who appreciate some precision in their murder. With all good things comes that ghost of nuclear meltdown. But I say accuracy and extra firepower never hurt anyone but what you're aiming at. Large pulse. Aside from making several clicks from where you fired them look like a rave, these things are also effective at making slag out of armor. The loss in body fluids is a reasonable trade to this mech warrior. Micro pulse laser. Because a small pulse laser was not weak enough, I suppose, decent for infantry. These weapons strike me as a result of a thought experiment more than any real demand from a war doctrine or market standpoint. A useless sidearm at best thanks to their range and damage. Heavy small laser. I'm too mixed in my feelings about these things to comment, which is a comment, I suppose. Heavy medium laser. Personally, I find accuracy to be far more important than punch. The heavy medium is a reasonably tempting offer on a whiteboard, but not on the battlefield. It also shows the mindset of a culture whose pilots are more skilled on average and thus can make the trade-off with confidence compared to your average merc unit. Heavy large laser. Using a heavy large is like trying to light a cigar with a blowtorch. It gets the job done and you might burn more than just a cigar. I hate being on either end of these things, but hey, if you want to cremate yourself in your cockpit, be my guest. Naval lasers. If you've ever witnessed one of these things, you're lucky. It means you weren't the target. The human misery these things have inflicted historically can only be regarded in abject horror or grim reverence. It would be a disservice to go into depth on energy weapons without covering famous platforms that use the hell out of them. Platforms like the Black Knight, because shooting someone in the face and then bludgeoning them to death with multi-ton arms and legs wasn't medieval enough already. The Awesome is a notable mention, with 3 PPCs as well as the cooling capacity and power plant necessary to sustain fire, potentially slagging nearly 2 tons of armor with every salvo. The Hunchback 4P is a favorite of mine, with 8 medium lasers and again the cooling capacity to use them. With a good pilot at the controls, you can land double the damage of the removed autocannon with every pull of the trigger. Getting a little more conventional, I feel the need to mention the Shrek PPC carrier. With the fusion engine, which is rare in a tank, 3 PPCs and the heat sinks to fire them continuously with 0 heat buildup, this is a frightening tank, especially when dug in. However, if you can survive to get within its minimum range, its paltry 7 tons of armor makes it much less scary. That's why they usually pair with demolishers, which I'll touch on in the next video. Now, the clans gave us one of the most terrifying energy weapon platforms that no engineer in the Inner Sphere could even conceive of, the Masakari. The most popular configuration had either 4 ER PPCs or 4 large pulse lasers with an LRM-10 for backup. It also had an advanced targeting computer to deliver each shot to the exact same location at range, and enough double heat sinks to cool a goddamn sun, which technically they were. This was a favorite of the Smoke Jaguars because it wasn't heavily dependent on ammo, and with the primary PPC configuration it could remove 4 tons of armor in a single salvo from a single location. The Draconis Combine pilots that, shall we say, discovered it, named it the Masakari after an ancient and massive battle axe. The axe head itself wasn't massive, but it was stuck on a 2 or 3 meter pole, and when it impacted a soldier after a full swing, well, let's just say that, like the mech, when its proper and fully trained use was witnessed, people lost their heads, in one way or another. So there you have the lowdown on energy weapons. Base models are some of the most robust and reliable weapons you can get, to the point where mechs with gun arms can actually punch with them. The more specialized you get, the more you have to play the trade-off game. Work your math out ahead of time and do extensive simulator testing before you go into the field with a new build. Next up in our nearly done series will be ballistic weapons. Defaulto's bread and butter more than mine, and he'll have some key things to say on the subject. Until then, thank you for watching, and maybe I'll see you on the battlefield.